talk about financial inclusion, we talk about the digital space, we've evaluated how the C-suite executives are evolving to the current dynamics. But one thing we need to be cognizant of is that in order for us to have a future-fit generation of leaders, we need to ensure that education is also taken care of. And that sets the tone and the basis for our conversation in the next few minutes. We will really take a look at ensuring that on the back of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns, that we are hopefully going to save a potential lost generation that might find itself lost within the education system, given the disparities that we witness that have been brought about by the digital divide and unequal access to quality education. Fifi.
Well, let me not hold you up any further. Let me introduce you to the panelists that Gugu, of course, will be speaking with, and take it away.
Siddharth Chatterjee is the United Nations representative in China. He has more than 25 years of experience in international cooperation, sustainable development, humanitarian coordination, and peace and security, acquired at the United Nations and externally. Professor Mamoketi Phakeng is a Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. She is a South African Professor of Mathematics Education. Dr. Obi Zekwesili is the Senior Economic Advisor for the Africa Economic Development Policy Initiative. She is a Chartered Accountant, former Nigerian Minister of Education, and former Vice President for the World Bank, Africa Region. The moderator is Gugulethu Mfupi.
To say I'm excited about this conversation would be an understatement. And with that said, let's get the show on the road by introducing our panelists. As you've heard their bios and their backgrounds, these are individuals who know a thing or two and quite considerable efforts that they've put into shifting the narrative regarding education across the continent. A very warm welcome and a good afternoon to my guests, Siddharth, Professor Phakeng, as well as Dr. Esekwitsi. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And I guess it's never too late to wish the two ladies on our panel a happy International Women's Day, despite the 24-hour delay. Thank you so much. We appreciate your feedback. And I think as we look to source solutions to this conversation to ensure that we don't lose a future generation on the back of the disparities of lack of equitable spread of education, on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important for us to really get an understanding of the lay of the landscape and where we currently stand. And Siddharth, I'm hoping to start and begin this conversation with you in terms of your new role and the years within which you've served at the United Nations. Education has been a key feature of some of the policies that you look to shape and influence and roll out in the various jurisdictions that you've worked, previously being Kenya and now being based in China. But I'd like to understand from your perspective, specific to sub-Saharan Africa and in line with the objectives of SDG 4, which speaks to ensuring inclusive and equitable equality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. How have you witnessed the impact of COVID-19, this particular pandemic, and how it has increased and exacerbated the disparities of unequal education on the continent? Siddharth?
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be amongst a group of illustrious women, and it is truly a privilege to join this conversation. So, COVID-19 struck the world like a bolt of lightning. And from that flash, we saw the contours of inequality emerge. And those contours have actually set back the gains that we made on women's rights, on equality of genders, on really pulling women out from being in as second-class citizens into what we've seen. And globally, this is not limited to Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, it's global. It's a global, the new pandemic of violence against women, of all forms of traditional harmful practices, which have again come back. We've seen an increase in child marriages, increase in teenage pregnancies. So to me, COVID-19 has reminded us that there are certain nuances as far as we as a human race are concerned. And those nuances became very stark. There was no country that avoided it. Even the most advanced economies in the world actually displayed in full glory where those inequalities lie. But for sub-Saharan Africa, the gains that we had already started to make in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, remarkable gains. I mean, who would say that in a country like Rwanda, we would have over 60% of the women as parliamentarians? Mm-hmm. Actually, they beat the record of the rest of the world in many ways. So to me, what this has done is set girls and women back. What we as a UN family, what we as the international community, what we as leaders, as thought leaders, as public policy makers need to be doing is put this back front and center all over again. And essentially, we need to be reminded of a reality. Educate a girl, you educate a family, you educate a community, and you educate a nation. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that feedback, Siddharth. And I think quite pertinent that you mentioned that when you educate a girl, you educate a family, you educate a community. And one thing we have witnessed across the continent before is a few years back in 2014, when girl children in Nigeria specifically were abducted and, as we know, faced the consequences of not having the opportunity to express their freedom, express their human right, or even participate in an equal and equitable opportunity to be educated. And Dr. Ezekwesili, this has certainly been an area of your expertise. You focused on this extensively in terms of bringing a voice to the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. And I'm keen to understand from you if there are any comparisons that we can draw between the devastating impact of COVID-19 and how it's continued to increase the divide of women within the education segment, and how this might potentially compare to some of the learnings that we can absorb from regarding the crisis of the Chibok girls.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm honored to be on the panel with my co-panelists. I think that there are very slim similarities. Nothing is as terrible as losing your freedom and being faced with the possibility of death. As of this time, we still don't know what it is that's going on in the lives of 112 of Chibok girls, as well as Leah Charibu, one girl that never came back after the second set of girls were abducted. So for the parents of those girls, they would very much love them to be at home, just like many Nigerian children or African children found themselves being at home because of the lockdown situations of COVID. So they don't quite approximate at all. However, the fact that these girls are definitely not anywhere getting any education is a similar thing as a child who is either not getting education at all because they are part of the very large 9 million out-of-school children that we continue to have on our continent, much more than any other continent in the world, or that they are not, even though the schools have partially opened, they are not getting the kind of instruction that would enable them to have quality learning outcomes. And so, yes, they may be in school, but school has become something that is not close to the standard of learning that that is desirable for children, or that they are in school and, as a matter of fact, the teachers are no longer committed to the education as much as is necessary because they feel abandoned. The two sectors that have suffered colossally during this period are the health and education sectors. They really have suffered, and a lot of cuts that have happened have been cuts to health and education, interestingly, and that is quite damning. That's also very problematic for majority of the continent. The reason that I say that is you'll find that public education is correlated to poverty, because most of the poor are the ones left in failing school systems on the continent. families that can afford to pay for quality education have taken their children out of the public school systems. And so when we talk about the challenges of poverty and inequality, we clearly are not paying much attention because the truth is, if you're abandoning your poor in failing public school systems, it means that education as a social mobility is not going to perform that function again. And so we are in trouble with that. It is something that we need to pay serious attention to. And that takes us to the broader issue of how the continent is, dealing with the COVID era as well as preparing itself for a post-COVID recovery. I essentially am one who, I kind of think that what COVID is doing is helping countries that are serious to imagine that a structural change, phenomenal structural change is happening to global economy. And when serious structural change is happening to global economy, you don't sort of continue with the same kinds of policies and the same kinds of priorities that you had before such a massive structural change. And when structural change of this kind of historical proportion is going on, education needs to be at the center of it. It is today that health should be health should be economy, and education should be economy. Full stop. Period. So and that kind of level, strategic level of thinking, I am not yet seeing it. We need to put human development at the center of everything that we're planning in this era and for post-recovery.
Human development at the center of the recovery of this particular economy on the continent in this sector and beyond. I think that's a critical element that I definitely want us to come back to, especially in terms of evaluating the strategic thinking that needs to go behind the investment and development of human development. Dr. Esekwesili. Professor Pakeng, I'd like to come to you this time, perhaps to also set your tone and add your voice to the opening remarks in terms of the devastation that we've witnessed the pandemic have on education. I think it's quite fitting that we understand from Siddharth that this is not necessarily something that is unique to the continent. We've seen it as well in developed economies. And of course, even the examples that have been laid out by Dr. Esekwesili is the fact that we've seen this as well having a significant impact in terms of a foundational or elementary development in terms of education, and how it continues to add a divide to the gender gap and gender equality across the continent. I'm keen to understand your thoughts, specifically because you play and work within the tertiary education space. You've often advocated for more women to participate in academia and, of course, in terms of completing their studies within these particular fields. 2020 has come and gone. We are still experiencing the ramifications of the impact of the pandemic. But what have your observations been in terms of the impact of the pandemic, specifically on female graduates within tertiary institutions?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I think Dr. Esekwesili and other colleagues have actually spoke about many of the issues. The one thing that I think we haven't foregrounded is that since the outbreak of COVID-19, levels of violence against women and girls have increased, and they've been exacerbated by mandatory lockdown. And that has been a big issue for us, particularly at university. So when the lockdown happened, we released students to go home. And then we started with remote learning, university students, I mean. And whilst we were expecting students to learn remotely, what we were releasing them to, some of them, were to environments that are hostile to women. And therefore, some of them lost basically a year, because then they had to deal or face the levels of violence that they face in their communities, in their homes. And so, I mean, in many ways, as we're talking about the impact of COVID-19, I keep thinking, of course, all of us are saying it brought to the fore the challenges that we've always known existed. Poverty, inequality, gender-based violence, it just made them visible. Even the impact of our travel and the way we treat the environment. And perhaps it was a blessing in disguise. Perhaps the disruption of the pandemic is what we needed to sort of to get into action, to even understand what it means to have higher education, where we argue for access to higher education, but actually we don't even consider where students come from and what it means to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Because even when students were at home and we give them laptops and data and everything that they need, what we couldn't give as institutions was network infrastructure, because that's the responsibility of government. Students who were in far-flung rural areas, we couldn't do that. And so we had to print materials or send them memory sticks so that they can use on their laptops. But this brought it to the fore. And then, of course, the other issue of vulnerabilities, as I said, that we found students who are not necessarily on financial aid, they're not supported by government or anything like that, or scholarship, they're supported by home. But actually, home, as much as it's financially okay, it is not safe for the girl. And in a normal, if there was no pandemic, they would be at the university, and some of them stay around until they complete. When they complete, they find jobs and they move on. So the kind of disruption that we've had, in a way, I think, has forced us to face the challenges that we've always not wanting to not facing as urgently as we should. Mm-hmm. Just one, finally, is to say it has also forced us, and I'm trying to look at the silver lining. In every crisis, there's a silver lining. I think the pandemic has also pushed us into an innovation mode to think about, so given how things are at the moment in our continent, how do we still make sure that students have access? Certainly for us university leaders, that it pushed us into innovation to say, so what do we do? What's the role of university residences? How do we deal with the challenges that attending to them is not in our remit, yes, but we deal with the consequences. So it forced us to do that. And so the innovation that comes out of that is useful too.
Professor Phakeng, I think very pertinent issues that you've also highlighted. And just in terms of evaluating these opening conversations, it does appear as though education has been a wonderful microcosm for us to evaluate the challenges that society faces overall. We hear about gender-based violence or violence against women, and we know that that is a societal issue that needs both parties and all stakeholders to come to the fore. We hear about network infrastructure, and we know that that's often incentivized and narrative which is invested in by business and corporate institutions. We also hear about an understanding of public schools, and that also speaks to public policy coming into play along to ensure that whether individuals and children are at public or private institutions, the quality of education is the same and not increasing the divide based on who has access and speaks to the financing. I want to come back to that level of strategic thinking that Dr. Ezekwesili alluded to. And perhaps, Professor Phakeng, I can start with you, given that you've already alluded to some of the interests and the areas in which academic institutions have been challenged. We know that education is a key area of focus for all entities. Most importantly, because it starts off with humans, human development and capital development, and people are at the center of economies. Let's start off by understanding from a university point of view, what is it that your institutions have done to start rethinking, remodeling, and recalibrating their approach to tertiary education, specifically not only to ensure that more women are kept at the fore, but that they continue to participate even in academic professions going forward. Are there any examples that you can allude to, perhaps, that you've instituted at the University of Cape Town?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we were very lucky that the pandemic happened at a time when we were working on our Vision 2030. And as VC, I was busy going around saying, disrupt thyself, because as a top university on the continent, it's very easy to be comfortable. And so whilst people were arguing, is the Vice Chancellor right to say we should disrupt ourselves? The pandemic disrupted us, and so we were forced to do that. So one thing that we did, we did that we hadn't planned to do it at that time, was to implement our online learning strategy. I mean, it's not an argument at Senate anymore whether blended learning is something that's valuable or not, because we've got to do it. So digitalized education is something that's at the center of what we do at the moment. It wasn't at the center as it used to be.
Sure.
We also been critiquing graduateness. What does it mean? What kind of graduate do we produce? And in terms of thinking that, and we were busy with the recalculation, in terms of thinking about the quality of graduate, this situation of the pandemic has come at the right time, because then it makes some of the questions not so controversial. They're in fact issues to discuss, that the kind of graduate that we should produce is one that's agile, that's supposed to be able to function in a rapidly changing world, that you can't be locked in the old way of doing things. And they've got to be enterprising. And so everyone has got to get out of the university with being entrepreneurial in their outlook to life. And so those kinds of conversations have taken place. I mean, issues of, do we need to be having, as a university, thinking about online high school, for example?
Sure.
Is this something that we should be talking about now, given that we can sort of be a pilot as to how that can work? We can offer our skills in terms of showing how that can work. So there's been a lot.
I'm going to interject there because I love the excitement, and I know that though as an institution you've gained some ground, you've introduced this new level of thinking, but as we know, you can't do it alone, and that really does speak to the kind of government policies and support that we're seeing, what it is that we're also seeing from the private sector in terms of investments, as you adequately say, into networks and infrastructure. And perhaps, Sidwath, I can throw this back to you in terms of understanding from a UN point of view, and understanding very clearly that the year 2030 is around the corner. We have our SDG goals, specifically SDG 4, in terms of equitable access to education for all genders. How is it that we need to be influencing governments across the continent to change and shape that narrative to ensure that human capital development lies at the center of how it is that we address and rebuild, even in this time of COVID-19?
You know, it's a very interesting question you ask, because I've just moved to China about a month ago and taken over as a resident coordinator here.
Yes.
I actually see here is a nation state which in the last 40 years has pulled about 800 million people out of poverty. And that's because they invested in human capital, in human development. It is because they pushed people out from, you know, the shackles of impoverishment and brought them out to be able to, you know, achieve their full human potential. And particularly from a gender point of view, don't forget, Chairman Mao Zedong once said that, you know, women hold up the sky. In fact, the emancipation of women that I've seen here, whether it's in the space of science and technology and business, it's quite remarkable that this is a country which has actually, in the last 7 years, pulled about 100 million people out of poverty. I'm really excited about being here because this is the kind of lessons I want to share between China and Africa. Major part of my career has been in Africa, and I feel very African. There are 3 Ps which will influence that change, which I've seen happen in China. First is political will. It should be undiluted and unquestionable political will. And this is where we all have a role, from the UN, from civil society, from foundations, from universities, from former vice presidents of the World Bank for Africa, as we have here. Be pushing the political will. And we have a Deputy Secretary General who belongs to the country where Honorable Ezekwesili comes from. And she says, you know, she tells all of us as resident coordinators, Amina Mohammed, you have to flip the orthodoxy. Without that, we will not change it. You know, we've been talking about this for the last 50 years. But as I talked about the COVID reality, it has laid bare the inequalities, and that inequalities between male and women, male and females on genders has been even more rampant out there. So whether it's sexual gender-based violence, whether it's increased teenage pregnancy or whatever.
Sure.
The second is public policy. How does the UN influence effective public policy and bring governments to apply that public policy and best practices? And the third is partnerships. And this partnership has to be public-private, it has to be public civil society, private academia, bring it all together. But what we need is scale. Africa is going to be 2.3 billion people by 2050, of which 890 million will be young people. If we make those right investments now, that is the continent of the future, where the future consumption and production will happen. What I will be telling the Chinese government is, work with Africa, let's build up human capital, let them learn important lessons from what China can share with them, and let's take this new development trajectory together. Over to you.
Partnerships, public policy, and political will, definitely 3 Ps that we need to abide by in terms of learning lessons that we can learn from our international counterparts. And I understand being globally competitive but locally relevant, right, to the local environment that we experience here on the continent, given the various demographics that exist. Dr. Ezekwesili, we have kept you quiet for way too long, and I'm keen to get your perspective on this one, specifically in terms of understanding the role of human capital development and what the costs could be of us potentially having a lost generation who have not been able to adequately participate in education, and what the economic cost to the continent and to ourselves as individuals could potentially be if we don't take the necessary action now.
Well, I think we have increasingly come to understand that poverty is a source of insecurity. And that, we cannot have a secure order if a large catch of our population are left in pernicious poverty. Current estimates show that because of COVID, the world is adding to the global number of the poor. It was declining, and suddenly here we are adding to that number. And it turns out that Africa is adding more of the numbers because out of some 50 million estimated to join the new poor, 23 million or thereabout will be from our own continent as a result of the impact of COVID. These kinds of shocks, whether they be pandemics or they be food shocks or they be economic shocks resulting from, say, a decline or collapse of oil prices, are things that should no longer be taking us by surprise as a continent. And that, goes to what my colleague Siddharth had said, which is that, political will is everything. In a continent that is better governed, we should not be taken by surprise by shocks. We have to have mastery over shocks. We need to build resilient systems. And one way to build resilient systems is to define a higher threshold of what governance should really mean on our continent. Our continent has been comfortable to be a laggard, among other continents. And that's not a good thing. Mm-hmm. We need to have leaders who are tired of failing. We need to stop being comfortable with hoping that now China is going to come and bail us out. That's rubbish. The truth is, we are a continent with incredible opportunity. China and India started their trajectory of growth without the level of cheap knowledge that technology has brought. Knowledge has never been cheaper in the history of humanity as it is today. Sure. The beginning of their own growth pathway was without what we consider our own revolution. Our own revolution is ICT, mobile telephony. That's the revolution that we've ever participated in. We've consumed it, and it has actually been useful that we consume it, right? But sure. Our young people are increasingly showing that they don't want to just be consumers of technology, that they also can play. So you're seeing a lot of startups out of Africa, out of Nigeria, out of Kenya, out of, just Rwanda, name the countries, out of South Africa. That is saying something to us, that post-COVID recovery can be defined in a way that absolutely changes the pathway. That's why I am excited about what the Vice Chancellor said. Yes. I am glad that she started saying disrupt yourself, even before COVID came to disrupt everything.
Dr. Ezekwesili, I'm going to jump in there. I'm loving the points that you've been highlighting in terms of the fact that we need to be tired of being second best. We need to be tired of being laggards and really having to disrupt ourselves, as you've alluded to the comments of Professor Pakeng. I'm aware that I've only got a minute left for this conversation. So very briefly, we're having this conversation, and as we know, we're speaking as representatives of different stakeholder groups. But before we're from academia, before we are from the media, before we are from policymakers and even leaders within government institutions, we are people. And the very same way that we have gathered here on a virtual platform, we ourselves have been educated. We are trying to educate other people, but there are members of our community who are also watching online here today. And I want us perhaps to share that messaging with them to disrupt themselves and to make a difference within their own personal circles in terms of education. And building up on the comments that have been shared by Dr. Ezekwesili in terms of disrupting ourselves and being tired of being laggards, it reminds me of the background that I've been watching of Professor Pakeng. You have a board behind you, Professor Pakeng, that says you are enough. Hashtag self-love. If we use that within the context to the audience that we are speaking to today and the youth that we have across the African continent who are frustrated by the lack of economic opportunities and educational opportunities, what's your message in a sentence to the African youth, and specifically the African female youth who is watching today and fatigued and frustrated by the lack of opportunities they have? You can start it off by saying you are enough and perhaps sharing it, closing it off with your closing comments to encourage the audience of young African women in our audience today. Dr. Ezekwesili, I think I'll start with you. Professor Pakeng, we'll come to you to also get a snapshot of that board behind you. And then, of course, Siddharth will wrap up with you as our gentleman on the panel today. Dr. Ezekwesili, let's start with you.
If there's any hope at all for the continent, it is the women and the young people. And let nobody even fool you into thinking that you have to repeat the failures of the past. You've got everything to act as global citizens. Your standard can be much higher than even the standards of those that are ahead of you. That's because you can create a new trail. Seek education, all the opportunities that are available through technology. Please don't use your mobile phone for chit chats. That's your future. That's your present.
Yes.
It can connect you to anything that you seek or desire to be in life.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Ezekwesili. I think strong words of encouragement and motivation to our youth. Professor Pakeng, if we come to you, you are enough to the young African female?
Indeed, you are enough. So make the most of every opportunity that presents itself to you. Opportunities come in all forms. It can come in the form of a pandemic, a challenge, a crisis. In every situation, try to find an opportunity and ask yourself, how do you get out of this? Even in the most terrible situation, you can grab something that you can use as a point of growth, as a foundation to build something much more substantial. You are enough. Thank you.
Siddharth, if we could have your closing remarks. You are enough. Your message to the young African female youth.
You know, I don't have the brilliance of the two ladies on the panel, so I will have to rely on the quote of George Bernard Shaw. And he said that some men and women see things as they are and ask why. And some dream things that never was and ask why not. For Africa, it's that why not moment. I am serving in a country which has challenged the why not notion, and that is why they've pulled 800 million people out of poverty in a span of 40 years. Africa can do that in 10 if the political will is there. Over to you.
Thank you so much to my panelists. I think I myself am invigorated to actually ensure that we share this message with people in various circles to make sure that we really do not waste a crisis, as the panel has highlighted. We need to be fatigued with being laggards of development. We need to ensure that the confidence and development of our human capital is prioritized, and most importantly, ensuring that the systems, the ecosystem is also in place, from infrastructure to having the necessary support from academia, and of course even additional funding and financing from the the private sector to enable the strategic development and solutions that are required to take this continent forward by placing human capital development at the center of it all. Thank you very much to my panelists for reinvigorating our thinking here today and really sharing us with a message of understanding that educating the African woman really does translate into educating and uplifting families and communities. To Professor Pakeng, as well as Siddharth Chatterjee, as well as Dr. Obi Ezekwesili, we thank you and appreciate your time today.